The writing elements for this week's assignment are thesis and argument, and citations and references. So let's start with thesis and argument. A thesis is the main idea. Your paper needs to have a thesis. You need to have a main idea. Every paragraph also needs a thesis. If you don't have a thesis, your reader will get lost. You might get lost too. And actually what makes writing so hard is when you don't really have a main idea, and then you really don't know what to say, and then it's really hard and you're lost. So when you write, you want to think about the idea you want to convey. That will be your thesis. And every paragraph of your paper should be related to the thesis of your paper. The paragraphs make the case for the thesis. And every sentence in a paragraph should be related to the paragraph's thesis. The sentences make the case for the paragraph's thesis. So students sometimes ask whether they really need to be arguing the point, but arguing doesn't mean fighting. So I got this off of Google, Google's dictionary. An argument, as people usually use it, is an exchange of diverging or opposite views, typically a heated or angry one. I've had an argument with my father. The other definition is a reason or set of reasons given with the aim of persuading others that an action or idea is right or wrong. There is a strong argument for submitting a formal appeal. So an argument in a paper is the second definition. And basically what I said about there being a thesis, you have an idea, everything should relate to that main idea. So you're arguing, you're persuading, and what you're persuading is that your idea is correct. All right, so you want to avoid these common mistakes. Filler. Pat has to write a 5-page paper that evaluates a country's current trade policy. Pat starts with a paragraph about the country's colonial history. Okay, so that's mistake number 1. You should always start with your thesis. Your reader should know right away what your paper is about. If you go back to the beginning of time, your reader is like, oh no, like what is this paper about? And, anyway. Okay. Mistake number 2, every paragraph should relate to the paper's thesis, which should be some claim about trade policy. Don't include extraneous material because you are worried about meeting the page requirement. So often you're like, okay, I have to write a 5-page paper. I don't have no idea what I'm going to say. I'm going to say, I don't know what I'm going to say. So I just start saying everything I know. And that's not going to write a good paper. How do you meet the page requirement if you don't use the filler? So what if you write your paper and just include paragraphs that relate to the thesis and it is too short? Usually, almost always, the problem is completeness. Did you explain all the terms that you use? Have you thought through weaknesses in your argument? So what do we mean about the argument? Well, I'll do this theoretically and then I'll give you some examples. So when you're thinking through the weaknesses in your argument, you want to play the devil's advocate and then answer the devil's objections. So let's say you make some kind of claim. Let's say you say that happiness is related to income. Then you want to play the devil's advocate and you might want to say, well, is it really related to income? Could it be something else? Is it associated? You want to try to argue against yourself and then answer yourself, and that will be a good paper. When you do this, you may realize that you want to make a different argument and you'll need to include more material. So it may be that once you try to support your claim, you realize that you can't really do it. So you've probably done exercises like this where you had to actually write persuasive writing, like in middle school or something. I remember my son wanted to persuade me that he needed a giant magnet. And part of the danger of these magnets is that, like, if you bring them into your house, like, things will fly through the air and attach themselves. And as he was explaining this to me, he realized he didn't have a case and he never asked for one. Okay, so some more common mistakes. The paper has no message. So this is basically the paper doesn't have a thesis. It doesn't have a main idea. So Kelly's paper provides numerous facts about trade in Chile, but makes no particular point. So you may say that the paper is about trade in Chile, but it's going to be a very hard paper to read and write if you don't really know what you want to say except a bunch of facts. Similar to watching a movie where one thing happens after another, but you're like, why? Why is this happening? You want to provide that why, and the thesis will do that for you. Okay, so writing a paper doesn't just mean assembling facts. You have to assemble facts and then come up with a take-home message about what it all means. Okay, so let me give you some examples. Here's the thesis statement for Gracia's paper on Chile. Chile's trade policy, which features low and uniform tariffs, is responsible for increasing trade openness and a more competitive export sector over the past 20 years. So what's her claim? Her claim is that the policy, which is these tariffs, are responsible for increasing trade openness and a more competitive export sector. So now the reader knows right away, okay, I expect this paper to show me that the trade policy, which she'll explain what it is, so that will take some room in the paper, and then she's going to show me that it's associated, like maybe in time, or maybe you can see over time, that once the tariffs went in, you had more trade, and also that the export sector grew. That's what I'm expecting to see. Compare that to Kelly's paper. Kelly starts her paper by saying, trade is an important feature of every country's economy. Chile is a country that has experienced trade on numerous levels. Kelly doesn't know what she wants to say. She hasn't thought through what is it about trade policy that she wants to say. You need to come up with an idea. Just telling me, this is kind of very vague, right? Trade is an important feature of every country's economy. That doesn't tell me anything, unless I wanted to make some kind of thesis about trade and I'm going to show that, it's a big share of GDP or something. But her paper is about Chile, so that first sentence doesn't relate to a thesis. And the second sentence is also just too vague. She needs to have a better idea. So how do you do that? Well, the hard part about writing a paper, it turns out, is not actually writing it down. It's the thinking. You have to come up with an idea. Okay. So once you know what you want to say, writing it down is pretty straightforward. So your experience of writing a paper, if you're experiencing it as a period of sort of like, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? And thinking, then you're doing it right. And that's a hard part. It's frustrating, but once you know what you're going to say, writing it down will be much easier. So take, for example, a text message. It's pretty easy to write a text message. And you can think of the thesis for your paper as a text message. It shouldn't be any longer than a text message. And you can think of supporting the thesis with a series of texts. When you write a text message, you're not like going to write to someone and you want to go, let's say you want to see if they want to like catch dinner together. You're not going to start by saying, well, lots of people are hungry around dinner time. You're going to go right to the point. And so if you think about your paper or your thesis as a main point, that might help you in terms of writing it down. It's not hard at all to write a text. You can write all the time. It's just the problem is when you're not sure what you want to communicate. Okay. So paragraphs in your model section. So this is for this week's writing assignment. What should those look like? So each section of your paper also needs to have a thesis. Like, what's the point of this section? And the point of your model section is to tell your reader how you think the world works for your particular topic. So you'll introduce your model, which is the formula you came up with in lab. So some y is a function of x1 and x2. And your thesis is, okay, here's my model. This is what I think is happening. I think that x1 and x2 are determining y. And then the rest of your paragraph will be, or section will be justifying the variables in your model. So your model says, this is how I think the world works, and your supporting argument is, and the sentences after it is, here's why. Now I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna justify it. And when you do that, you'll say, okay, well, Strauss and Thomas said that income is related to, let's say x1 is income, is related to health. So the justification comes from the literature. Okay, so you'll have to use in-text citations in your model section. And in lab, you have a Palgrave and a Journal of Economic Literature source. So those are the references that you should show up in your model section. As you make your argument for your model, you should cite the sources. And then there's a references section. Okay, so I have not given you the Econ style guide for a reason. And that's that when you go to write a paper in your other classes, it's very rare that a professor hands you a style guide. So I want you to know where it is. I want you to get used to going to use it. The rest of this, I'm going to read through it, and I'm going to go ahead and show you where the Econ style guide is. But it says, do it right, pay attention to the details, where there's a period, what is in quotation marks, what is italicized, etc. Okay, so the references section is, yeah, it's tedious, but basically when you do it right, you'll make sure that you have all the information, and it's a good skill to have, which is to pay attention to the details. So let me go out to the to show you where the Econ style guide is. So I'm going to type in here, it's econ.unm.edu. It brings us to our web page. Go to the undergraduate program, go to the Econ style guide. Okay, and that should appear. Okay, so here it is. All right, so we went all over this in a prior lecture, but here's the stuff that you need. How do you do it? Okay, so we looked at in-text citations. I think we already went over that. But here's the references. Here's how you do the references. So make sure you do them the way you're supposed to do them. Okay, what is the Palgrave? The Palgrave is a chapter in an edited volume. And so you have the authors, and then you have some editors. And you may have to go back to the Palgrave to get those editors, but you should be able to do that. Should be pretty straightforward. What else? The Journal of Economic Literature article, that's a journal article. So look here, make sure that you follow this. That's the assignment. And that's it. That's it for now. I hope that helped. Let me know if you have questions.